Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
My mother took a bite of her shrimp cocktail, smiled at my brother's giant kitchen island like it was some kind of monument, and said, "Your brother's housewarming party was so lovely. When are you going to catch up?" I looked at her, calm as ever, and said, "I hosted mine last year. You just weren't on the guest list." Her fork froze midair. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was just done pretending I didn't notice. The silence that followed my comment was brief but delicious, just long enough for every eye at the table to twitch in my direction, just long enough for my brother to raise his eyebrows and for Kara, his wife, to give that little smirk she thinks no one notices. I didn't look at any of them. I let my mother's fork hover there, still dripping cocktail sauce onto the tablecloth, and I returned to slicing my steak like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just planted a silent grenade in the middle of her perfect dinner party. It wasn't the first time I'd watched her blink at my life like it was a distant city she couldn't be bothered to visit. My mother had mastered the art of the graceful omission, forgetting birthdays without technically forgetting them, skipping over my accomplishments in conversations with surgical precision, and always finding a way to circle back to Eric, my younger brother, as though his existence somehow completed hers in a way I never quite managed. It didn't matter that I had bought my own house before 35, that I paid it off myself without help, without a cosigner, and without a man. It didn't matter that I got promoted 3 times in 4 years while Eric was bouncing between mediocre sales gigs and blaming the economy. None of it mattered. Because he was the son, and I was the daughter who would do fine on her own. They never said it directly, of course. My parents were far too Midwestern for that. No, their disappointment came in subtler forms, like showing up 3 hours late to my college graduation brunch because Eric had a flat tire, or sending a "get well soon" text while I was recovering from surgery, without a single call or visit. But they showed up to Eric's birthday dinner with a bakery cake and a wrapped iPad. I still remember my mother saying, "We just want him to feel celebrated this year," as if I had never once needed to feel anything other than useful. So when she asked me, in that sing-song voice she saves for polite conversation and soft jabs, when I planned on catching up to Eric, who had just finished showing off his kitchen's custom cabinets and built-in wine fridge, I decided I wouldn't let it slide this time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw a fit. I didn't even look angry. I just said the truth, plainly and without apology. I hosted mine last year. You just weren't on the guest list. The beauty of it was that it wasn't even a lie. I did host a housewarming party. I set the date, made the menu, planned the playlist. I even printed name cards for the dining table. And then, on a whim I can only describe now as both petty and necessary, I deleted the invitations before I hit send. Not a single message went out. I sat on my back porch that night with a glass of wine, a slow jazz playlist humming through the open door, candles flickering in the wind, and not a soul to interrupt the peace. I roasted a whole chicken with lemon and rosemary, uncorked a bottle of Bordeaux I had been saving for the right moment, and toasted myself. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sorry. I just realized that I was finally done performing for people who would never clap. And they never noticed. They didn't call the next day to ask how it went. They didn't wonder why they hadn't received an invite. There were no passive-aggressive texts from Mom about hearing through the grapevine or from Dad asking for directions. There was just silence. And in that silence, I found a kind of confirmation that no amount of attention could ever give me. I had made myself absent from their world, and the absence didn't register. That's when something inside me snapped into place. Not in the way things break, but in the way a puzzle piece finally finds where it belongs. It wasn't rage. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. I saw, perhaps for the first time without illusion, what role I played in this family. I was the self-sufficient one, the fallback, the one who didn't require attention because I didn't ask for it, because I learned a long time ago that asking only led to disappointment. I was a seat filler in the theater of Eric's life, applauding on cue, smiling for photos, never asking for a spotlight of my own. And they liked it that way. After I made the comment at the dinner party, Eric tried to brush it off with a laugh, that nervous chuckle he does when he doesn't know if he's being insulted or complimented. Wait, really? You had a housewarming last year, he asked, leaning toward me like he expected me to explain it away. Maybe say it was a joke, or that it was just a small get-together and not worth mentioning. I didn't take the bait. I just smiled, sipped my wine, and said, it was lovely. Intimate. Everyone who needed to be there was. Kara choked a little on her sparkling water, and I swear I saw Dad give me a look, one of those quiet glances that meant he'd be bringing this up later, likely in the form of a question disguised as concern. Are you feeling okay these days? You seem tense lately. I'd heard them all before. The truth is, they never really knew how to respond to me when I wasn't making their lives easier. When I wasn't the one offering to host, to clean, to drive, to listen. When I stopped being their emotional janitor, they didn't know where to put me. After dinner, I stayed long enough for cake, but not long enough for the board games Eric liked to pull out to show he was still fun. On my way out, Mom kissed me on the cheek and said, next time, don't be such a stranger. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because next time, if there even was a next time, she wouldn't be invited either. As I drove home, I didn't feel triumphant. That's not the word. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't even vindication. It was more like stillness. Like I had finally closed a door I'd been holding open with my foot for years, waiting for someone to notice, to walk through it, to say, hey, we see you too. And when they didn't, I let the door swing shut behind me. And you know what? It was quiet on the other side. But not lonely. Just quiet enough to hear myself think. Quiet enough to realize that being invisible hurts a lot less when you're the one who chooses to disappear. Driving home that night, the road felt longer than usual, not because of traffic or bad weather, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying that moment at the table, over and over, as if it had finally grown tired of being polite and had decided to scream through the windshield. My mother's expression after I delivered my carefully measured line had been priceless, her perfectly painted lips slightly parted, her hand frozen mid-bite, her eyes wide with something between confusion and insult, as if I had just committed an act of emotional treason at her precious shrine to family harmony. And yet, no one at the table, not my father, not my brother, not even Kara, who loved to whisper every morsel of family gossip over wine and fake laughter, had challenged the truth of what I'd said. No one protested. No one asked, wait, what do you mean? Instead, they'd all shifted uncomfortably in their seats, each suddenly fascinated by their drinks or their forks or the ceiling fan humming above them. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. I pulled into my driveway, the motion-activated porch light flickering to life like it had been waiting for me, loyal in a way no human had managed to be in recent memory. My house sat still and peaceful, bathed in the kind of warm glow that comes only from knowing no one else's expectations live within those walls. I opened the front door, took off my shoes, and allowed the weight of the evening to settle onto my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a kind of cloak, the kind worn by someone who's done pretending they don't see what's been in front of them for years. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat down at the kitchen island I had designed myself, and let the memories come, one after another, uninvited but no longer unwelcome, like guests I had finally decided to let speak. There was that one Christmas, when I drove 4 hours in the snow with a tin of handmade cookies and a bottle of scotch I knew my father liked, only to find out that the family dinner had been moved to Eric's house 2 towns over, and no one had bothered to tell me. When I walked into my parents' living room, it was empty except for a note on the fridge that read, "See you at Eric's, Pat." I had stood there alone, the foil on the cookies still warm, and stared at that note until I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry, so I did neither. I simply turned around, drove home, and ate half the tin myself in silence. Or my college graduation, when I gave the valedictorian speech, something I hadn't told them in advance, because I wanted it to be a surprise. I remember standing up there on the podium, looking out over the crowd and thinking, they're going to be so proud. And when the ceremony ended, and the crowd began to spill out into the courtyard, I scanned every face, every cluster of hats and camera flashes, looking for them. I finally found them in the parking lot, leaning against Dad's car, annoyed that the ceremony had taken so long, Mom complaining about her heels, Eric asking if we could just skip brunch because he had plans. No one mentioned the speech. No one asked how it felt. No one even brought it up. I could have been anyone. It wasn't that I expected them to throw parades or build monuments to my achievements. I'm not naive. I never believed life owed me that kind of validation. But what gnawed at me, what had always gnawed at me, was the staggering ease with which they forgot me, how natural it seemed for them to look past me, to pivot every conversation, every celebration, every shared breath, back toward Eric. His new job, even if it was just a lateral move. His new car, even if it was leased. His second child, even if he admitted he hadn't wanted a second child. Everything he did was met with applause. Everything I did was met with, "Oh, I didn't know that." So when my mother, still riding the high of Eric's kitchen remodel and backyard pergola, had leaned across that table and asked when I was planning to catch up, she wasn't just making a passing comment. She was crystallizing years of minimization into a single, offhand insult, spoken in the tone of someone who genuinely believed she hadn't said anything wrong. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was what kept me awake that night. Not the comment itself, but the fact that she truly didn't understand what was so offensive about it. The next morning, I got a text from Kara. Just 3 words. "You okay?" It wasn't warmth. It wasn't concern. It was reconnaissance. She was poking the wound to see how deep it went, whether I was about to make things uncomfortable for her by reacting like a human being. I didn't respond. I didn't owe her an explanation for a war she had helped escalate for years with her saccharine little digs and her constant competition disguised as sisterhood. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Dad. A rare thing, considering he typically communicated through nods and muttered mumps. I let it go to voicemail. I already knew what it would say. Something generic. Something passive. Something like, "Your mom didn't mean anything by it." And I didn't need to hear that, not because I didn't believe it, but because I believed it too much. That was the problem. She didn't mean anything by it. She never meant anything by any of it, because meaning would imply intention, and intention would imply responsibility. But I wasn't looking for apologies anymore. I wasn't looking for explanations. I wasn't even looking for closure. What I wanted, in a way I hadn't realized until that dinner party, was confirmation that I had been right to stop inviting them into my moments. That I had been right to stop performing, right to stop giving them space in my life they hadn't earned, right to build a home that didn't include them. I wanted to know that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't bitter without cause, that I hadn't fabricated a childhood of emotional neglect out of pettiness or jealousy or some overblown sense of injustice. And now I had that confirmation. It came not in an apology or an admission, but in silence. In that frozen fork. In those averted eyes. In the absence of protest. In the realization that, even after I pointed out the exclusion, no one tried to fix it. No one said, "Why didn't you invite us?" No one said, "We're sorry we missed it." No one even asked what the party was like. Because deep down, I think they knew they hadn't missed it. They had simply never looked for it. That night, I sat at my kitchen island, lit a candle, and opened my journal, not the leather-bound kind full of flowery reflections, but the hardback one with creased pages and ink smudges, the one where I wrote the things I didn't say out loud. And I wrote just 6 words. They didn't miss it. I left. The third time I heard the words, "Just let it go," from someone in my family, I remember standing in the guest bathroom at my parents' house, staring at my reflection beneath harsh yellow vanity lights that made me look older, harder, maybe even bitter. Though the truth is I didn't feel bitter, I felt awake, and that awakening had come not in one dramatic epiphany, but in slow, deliberate slices across the years, each small enough to excuse, yet sharp enough to scar. My father had followed me down the hallway after dinner, his voice low and soft, not unkind, but unmistakably patronizing. As if I were a child having an overreaction to a scraped knee rather than a woman who had spent the better part of 4 decades being emotionally bypassed by the very people who were supposed to notice her. "You can't carry this stuff forever," he'd said, one hand gripping the doorknob, the other still holding a half-empty glass of that cheap red wine they always served. "It'll poison you if you don't let it go." And I just stood there, brushing lint off my black sweater, trying to suppress the urge to laugh, not because what he said was funny, but because it was so painfully rehearsed, as if he had lifted it straight out of a self-help book written by someone who had never been overlooked in their life. It wasn't the first time someone had told me to move on, to forgive, to loosen my grip on the decades of slights, omissions, and cold dismissals that had become the quiet rhythm of my relationship with this family. But what they never understood, what they refused to understand, was that I had already let go, just not in the way they wanted. I had let go of waiting for them to ask questions. I had let go of hoping for an apology. I had let go of the fantasy that one day my mother would pull me aside and whisper that she was proud of me, or that my father would look me in the eyes and say that he had been wrong to always default to Eric. What I hadn't let go of, and what I had no intention of relinquishing, was the right to name what had happened and to remember it in full color, not bleached and softened for everyone else's comfort, but jagged and raw, just as it was. That particular dinner had been Kara's idea, a Sunday meal to reconnect, which was rich coming from someone who still referred to my condo as your little townhouse thing, and who once told me with a straight face that she envied how I didn't care about kids, as if my decision to remain child-free had been one born out of apathy rather than choice. We were halfway through the main course, overcooked pork loin and a watery green bean casserole, when my mother had brought up Eric's newest promotion, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be little more than a lateral shift with a new job title and a minor pay bump. Still, the table lit up with praise, Dad raising his glass, Kara patting his hand, Mom beaming like he'd won the Nobel Prize. And then, with a forkful of beans halfway to her mouth, my mother had turned to me and asked, "How's your little marketing firm doing these days?" Her voice had been dipped in that thin layer of polite detachment she reserved for topics that neither interested nor impressed her. "My agency just signed a 7-figure account with a tech client," I had replied, as evenly as I could, though I already knew it wouldn't land. And, of course, it didn't. There was a pause, followed by an "oh, that's nice," and then Kara jumped in to talk about the PDA's spring fundraiser. My accomplishment evaporated like steam above a cooling pot roast, acknowledged, but not absorbed. So when Dad tried to intercept me later and tell me I needed to let go, what he was really saying, what they were all always saying, was that they didn't want to be reminded. Not of the things they'd done or the things they'd failed to do, but of the fact that I noticed. My awareness was the problem, not their behavior. My memory, my unwillingness to laugh it off, was the irritant in their otherwise smooth narrative of family unity and harmless forgetfulness. And the worst part, the part that still curls like smoke inside my chest when I think about it, is that for a long time, I tried to meet them halfway. I tried the cheerful updates. I sent photos of the house renovations. I hosted Thanksgiving 2 years in a row, made custom name cards, even baked pies from scratch using Mom's old recipes. I invited them to my art show opening, printed fancy invitations, bought extra wine, cleaned until my hands were raw. No one came. Not once. Not ever. There was always something. Eric had a conference, Dad had back pain, Mom didn't want to drive at night. And when I stopped inviting them, when I finally stopped playing the game, they acted like I was the one who had pulled away. Like I had gone cold without warning. Like my silence had come from nowhere. But silence is never born in a vacuum. It's built, layer by layer, over years of being talked over, dismissed, redirected, or worse, ignored altogether. It's crafted in the small moments, the mundane betrayals, like when they forgot my birthday for the 3rd year in a row, or when they mailed me a Christmas card without a single handwritten note inside, while Eric's envelope contained a check and a personal letter from Mom about how much she missed him. It's born in the slow erosion of effort, in realizing you're the only one reaching out, the only one remembering, the only one clapping in a room where no one is clapping back. And maybe it sounds petty to someone on the outside. Maybe it looks like I'm the one holding a grudge, the one keeping score. But to me, it's not about scorekeeping, it's about truth. It's about refusing to pretend that a family who couldn't be bothered to show up gets to act offended when I stop opening the door. It's about drawing a line that says, "You don't get to wound me and then police how I heal." I didn't answer my father that night. I waited until he walked away, back to his recliner and his TV and his silent enabling, and I slipped out the door without saying goodbye. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a text from Eric, just a thumbs-up emoji, presumably in response to some family group message I hadn't bothered to read. I deleted the thread without opening it. Because healing, I've found, doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like absence. Sometimes it looks like not replying. And sometimes it looks like standing in the guest bathroom of your parents' house, staring at your reflection and deciding that being the villain in their story is better than being invisible in your own. The invitation came wrapped in off-white cardstock, the kind with fake gold foil borders and embossed lettering that pretends to be elegant, but mostly just screams performance, and as soon as I pulled it from the envelope, my name misspelled, of course. I knew exactly what kind of evening it was going to be. It was Kara's doing. The cursive font was too frilly, the phrasing too syrupy, the words "family tribute dinner" arranged with that delicate layer of condescension only she could pull off with a straight face. She had always been obsessed with curating moments, dressing up hollow gestures as meaningful events, orchestrating smiles and applause like they were her personal symphony. And this dinner, allegedly a celebration of Eric's contributions to the family, was nothing more than another installment of her never-ending PR campaign, a pageant of forced affection where Eric would once again be crowned by his enablers, while the rest of us played supporting roles or, in my case, the invisible stagehand backstage. I almost didn't go. I stared at that invitation for 2 full days, letting it sit on my kitchen counter like a dead thing I didn't want to touch, debating whether to spare myself the headache or lean into the discomfort and take my seat at the table, knowing full well what I'd find when I got there. But something inside me, some old, rusted switch long left untouched, flipped into place, and I realized that I had no intention of staying quiet this time. I wouldn't throw a scene or stand on the table or raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had spent years perfecting the art of subtle disruption, of dismantling their polished illusions with a single sentence that cut deeper than any scream ever could. So I texted Kara that I would be attending, and she replied with an unnecessary exclamation point, no doubt already imagining me sitting quietly in the corner, politely clapping as she unveiled the slideshow she had probably built with dramatic transitions and royalty-free music. The night of the dinner, I wore black. Not funereal, not dramatic, just sleek, quiet, intentional. The restaurant they had reserved was one of those pretentious places with exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs dangling like stage lights, and chairs that looked stylish, but made your back ache after 20 minutes. I arrived exactly on time, not early enough to help, not late enough to draw attention. The host led me to a long table tucked into the back room, where Kara was already fluttering about in some nauseating floral dress, placing name cards at each seat like it was a wedding reception. Mine was at the far end, near the kitchen door, away from the centerpiece, next to a couple of Kara's cousins I hadn't seen in years. Her subtle way of making a statement, as if I wouldn't notice, or maybe as if I would, and that was the point. Eric stood near the bar, already holding court, laughing in that exaggerated way he always did when he knew people were watching. He looked polished and smug, in that cheap way that comes from being too adored too often. My mother waved me over briefly, kissed my cheek with the stiffness of habit, then turned back to Kara mid-sentence without finishing her hello. My father nodded and said something like, "Glad you could make it," which translated, as always, to "don't make a scene tonight." I took my seat. I smiled when necessary. I sipped the mediocre wine. I waited. The dinner itself was as tedious as I'd expected: overcooked halibut, a tired salad, and endless toasts that revolved around Eric's selflessness, his support, his unwavering dedication to family, all of which sounded vaguely aspirational, like words pulled from a PowerPoint rather than any actual memory. My mother recited a list of his achievements, most of which involved him showing up to barbecues or fixing the gutter last summer. Kara stood and spoke about how Eric had been her rock during the pandemic, as though he hadn't spent most of it golfing and complaining about remote work. The slideshow came next, a montage of photos spanning childhood to present, Eric in football jerseys, Eric holding the baby, Eric posing with mom at a backyard party. Not a single frame of me. It was calculated, of course, but more than that, it was revealing, because it wasn't just that they forgot to include me. It was that they had built an entire version of family that simply didn't have space for me. I wasn't missing, I had been edited out. And as I watched that screen flash images of a curated life I had been excluded from, I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. They were finally showing me, without apology, how little they believed I mattered. Then Kara stood up again, her voice syrupy, almost trembling with false emotion, and announced that there would be an open floor for family tributes, starting with me, since, in her words, I was always so eloquent. She smiled like a woman offering a poisoned drink in a crystal glass, certain I wouldn't dare raise it to my lips. I stood slowly, not because I needed time to think, my words had been rehearsed in my head for weeks, but because I wanted to watch their faces, to measure the tension in their bodies, to let them stew in the unknown for just a few more seconds. I picked up my glass and looked at each of them in turn. My mother, with her forced smile and frozen posture. My father, already looking away. Kara, hiding behind her teeth. And Eric, pretending to be amused, but gripping the table just slightly too hard. Tonight, I began, we celebrate contributions, family, support, showing up. And I've been thinking a lot about that. About what it means to show up. I paused, let the words hang like fog. Some people show up loudly. They arrive with gifts, with stories, with noise, and they make sure everyone sees them. Others show up quietly. They work behind the scenes, clean up the mess, hold space, remember birthdays no one else remembers. And sometimes, they stop showing up at all not because they don't care, but because they've finally realized no one notices when they do. No one moved. No one breathed. So here's my tribute, I said, raising my glass slightly. To the ones who raise themselves. Who grow in shadows, who cheer for others and receive nothing in return. To the ones who stop clapping, not out of spite, but because they've learned that silence is the only language some people understand. I smiled, not wide, not cruel, just enough. Then I sat down. The room stayed quiet. Kara blinked too many times. Eric shifted in his seat. My mother stared at the table like it had betrayed her. My father reached for his water, but his hand was shaking slightly. No one knew what to say, and that was the point. I didn't stay for dessert. I stood, picked up my coat, thanked the server, and left without saying another word. As I walked to my car, the night air sharp and honest against my face, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had finally been heard, but because I had finally spoken, not for them, not to fix anything, but for myself. And somewhere, deep inside, a door closed, and this time, I didn't leave it ajar. The morning after the dinner, I awoke not to the sound of messages or missed calls or frantic apologies, but to the same silence that had filled the corners of my life for so many years, an unremarkable stillness that no longer surprised me, no longer stirred that familiar ache for acknowledgement or repair. The birds outside my window chirped against the cold pane like nothing had changed, like the world hadn't tilted in the quiet defiance of my toast, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't reach for my phone to see if I had been seen. If my words had pierced through the varnished shell they had built around themselves, if anyone had decided to do the unthinkable and ask, "Are you okay?" There were no messages. Not from my mother. Not from my father. Certainly not from Kara. The group chat, I imagined, was buzzing with careful recalibrations, with whispered conversations about how I had lost it, how I had made things uncomfortable, how I had ruined the mood of their meticulously planned evening. But I wasn't there to read it. I had muted that thread months ago, long before the tribute dinner was even conceived, back when I still held the faint hope that my absence might trigger concern, or at least curiosity. It hadn't. And that knowledge, once unbearable in its weight, now simply floated around me like dust, ever present, but no longer suffocating. I spent that day not in mourning or regret, but in motion. I cleaned the grout in my kitchen, reorganized the books in my office, repotted a dying fern I had neglected for weeks. There was something ritualistic in it all, something almost ceremonial about tending to the things I had control over while the rest of the world spun obliviously onward. I turned on my favorite record, Billie Holiday, low and scratchy, and let it fill the rooms with its melancholy defiance, her voice wrapping around the walls like silk laced with smoke. At some point in the late afternoon, I went out to the porch with a glass of wine and sat beneath the string lights I had hung myself last spring, back when I had briefly entertained the idea of hosting another gathering, a real one this time, not the phantom dinner of the year before. But as the months passed and no one reached out, not even to ask how I was settling into the new place, the idea faded, then died, and the lights became decorative rather than functional, silent witnesses to another chapter closed before it ever began. It was then, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the air cooled with that late autumn bite, that I noticed the letter in the mailbox. A real letter. Handwritten. My name spelled correctly. No return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately, slanted, careful, a little unsure. My mother's. I stared at it for longer than I should have, my fingers tracing the edge of the envelope as if it might reveal something about the contents within. Finally, I opened it with the corner of my nail and unfolded the single sheet inside. No, dear Natalie. No date. Just one paragraph, written in small, almost timid script. I didn't know you felt that way, it read. I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know where to start. But I saw your face that night, and it looked like someone I didn't recognize. And I think that's my fault. I read the words twice, then a third time, trying to locate the emotion I was supposed to feel. Was it relief? Vindication? Sadness? Something in me had expected this moment to be more climactic, more transformative, the culmination of a lifetime of unspoken wounds finally acknowledged. But it wasn't. It felt unfinished. As though she had left the page halfway written, unsure whether to apologize or defend herself, unwilling to lean fully into either direction. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my kitchen sink, with old receipts and expired coupons, not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't ready to decide what to do with it. Some things I had come to understand don't need immediate resolution. Some truths simply need to exist in silence, without the pressure of response or repair. Later that evening, I opened the family group chat, not to speak, but to look. Just for a moment. My name hadn't come up once. There were photos from the dinner, blurry smiles and raised glasses, Kara's cousin with her mouth mid-laugh, Eric in the center, as always, his arms slung around Mom, her face pressed close to his like the image of maternal pride she always projected. No one had mentioned my speech. No one had even mentioned my absence after the toast. It was as though I had been swallowed by the night and digested without consequence. I typed a message, "I'll be hosting again next spring." Then I stared at it for a long time, watching the blinking cursor like it might offer guidance. I hovered over the send button, then deleted it. Not out of bitterness, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I wasn't inviting them back in, not yet, maybe not ever. Because this time, I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to host in order to be seen. I didn't need a guest list to validate the space I had built with my own two hands. I closed my phone, turned off the porch lights, and stepped back into the house. The floor creaked beneath my feet in that familiar, comforting way. I poured another glass of wine and settled into the armchair by the window, the one I had found at a thrift shop, and reupholstered myself, a project no one in my family ever asked about. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. The wind stirred the leaves. My house sat quiet, strong, mine. And as I sat there in the glow of the room I had made for myself, I realized something else, something deeper, something final. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't dramatic or explosive or satisfying in the way the movies tell you it should be. Sometimes it looks like living well in your own silence, in a house with no doorbell, where no one knocks unless you invite them. And sometimes you never do.